afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I couldn't be happier to welcome all of you to a unique format today for this year's Rama S. Mehta program entitled Families in Flight, Today's International Refugee Crisis. The Rama S. Mehta Lecture was established by the late John Kenneth Galbraith and Catherine Atwater Galbraith in memory of Rama S. Mehta, a scholar of modern Indian family life. I'm pleased to welcome the Galbraith's son, Ambassador Peter Galbraith, who's sitting here in the front row, along with two of Rama Mehta's granddaughters, Molika Mehta and Ahilya Mehta. Right there they are, over there. Great, well, we're just so happy to have you all here. Since 1981, the Mehta Lecture has brought distinguished public figures to Cambridge to address pressing contemporary issues concerning women in the developing world. It would be hard to think of a more urgent issue today than the global refugee crisis. At the end of 2014, the UN estimated that 1 out of every 122 people on Earth was displaced and seeking refuge or asylum. We are fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts to address this critical subject with us today. And I think the fact that so many of you are here is a testament to how important we all know this issue is. I especially want to welcome members of the classes of 1971, 1976, and 1986. These are Harvard classes who have returned to Harvard for their reunions. Welcome also to members of the class of 1962, who will celebrate their reunion in May. I'd like to thank the Harvard Alumni Association for its partnership in today's event, which has made your presence possible. As Harvard's Institute for Advanced Study, Radcliffe fosters interdisciplinary inquiry into important and multifaceted subjects. We bring together leading thinkers from across the Harvard campus and around the world to investigate questions that transcend any one Harvard school or any one discipline. And we are committed to sharing innovative work with the broadest community possible through public events like this one today and many others. For example, we will hold an annual science symposium. This year it's entitled From Sea to Changing Sea, a science symposium about oceans, which will take place on Friday, October 28th at 9 o'clock, right here in this room in the Knopfel Center. The calendar cards on your chairs list many more events coming up this fall. I hope you'll join us for as many of them as you can, either here in Cambridge or through our website, where we live stream many of our events and we post videos of more of them afterwards. You can also use the website to register for events. Our programs are always free and open to the public, but we do request that you register so we can provide the most comfortable accommodations. Our events and all of our work here at Radcliffe depends on the generosity of our supporters. I'm grateful to the donors from every Radcliffe and Harvard class who make it possible for the Radcliffe Institute to probe deeply and share widely our inquiry into the most vital world issues. So just why is the refugee question so urgent today? Displacement, after all, is an ageless problem. One of the world's most ancient written stories is about exiles journeying through the desert for 40 years, and numerous oral traditions similarly locate their society's origins in banishment and wandering. The refugee crisis of the 20th and 21st centuries, however, are truly something new and different under the sun. Our modern category of refugee status only emerged with the rise of the nation state, which by definition created its opposite, statelessness. The first people to be uprooted by war and identified as refugees with a claim on the conscience of the world were Belgians in World War I. Sadly, not many years later, even more massive numbers of people were displaced by World War II, heightening worldwide sensitivity to the need for systematic refugee relief and inspiring the United Nations to issue the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But official coordinated relief operations took 2 more years to materialize. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, was established in 1950. The first emergency that the UNHCR responded to was the Hungarian uprising of 1956, an event within the lifetime and memory of some of the people in this room. Today, there are more than 65 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Nearly 34,000 people flee their homes each day. Most of them seek refuge somewhere in Africa or the Middle East. Fewer than 20% enter Europe or the Americas. About 80% of the world's refugees are women and children. Let's look closely at one example for a better sense of exactly what displacement means for them. Drought and war in Somalia robbed a woman named Isha and her family of the livestock that had once made them prosperous. When they had nothing left, Isha and her 5 young children walked through the desert to Dadaab, 62 miles inside the Kenyan border. By the time they arrived, the skin of the children's feet had been entirely worn away. Dadaab opened in 1991 as a temporary camp for the 90,000 Somalis that the UN estimated would be uprooted by warfare in their home country. Today, Dadaab houses nearly 500,000 people, Sudanese, Ethiopians, Congolese, and Ugandans, as well as Somalis, making it the 3rd largest city population-wise in Kenya. It has schools, hospitals, and a commercial economy. But camps themselves are problematic. Infectious disease, supply shortages, and gender-based violence run rampant. Camps also require toleration by their host countries, and that tolerance may not last forever. The Kenyan government, in fact, has announced plans to close Dadaab. The current president of the International Rescue Commission recommends that camps be replaced with greater support to host countries to integrate newcomers into the mainstream of their societies. Yet recent events in Europe, not to mention our own government's response to migrants crossing our southern border, show that hopes for a warmer welcome may not be realistic. The most pressing refugee crisis in recent months has been the one created by the violent unrest in Syria, which has resulted in 13 million Syrian refugees. In today's panel, experts close to that crisis will share their expertise and insight into this crisis and other refugee situations with us. Notably, one of our panelists is a photographer, a testament to Radcliffe's commitment to the arts as contributing in crucial ways to deeper knowledge and understanding of important issues like this one. So here's how the day is going to work. Jacqueline Bhabha will introduce the participants and moderate the discussion. Jackie is a professor of the practice of health and human rights at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and director of research at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights here at Harvard. And I have to say, she is also a great friend of the Radcliffe Institute. The panel will conclude with a question and answer period. We'll be setting up a microphone in the center aisle. I ask if you have a question that you step up to the microphone. There'll be a line behind it. Introduce yourself and then ask your question. After the panel, I hope you will join us for a continued discussion at a reception in Fay House, which is our main administrative building here at the Radcliffe Institute, right next door. Once again, thank you so much for coming, and now join me in welcoming Jackie Bhabha.
Hello and welcome, Liz. Thank you so much for your very erudite and appropriate introduction. Radcliffe always manages to choose topics which are really of critical importance to many of us at the university. And as you said, you span many disciplines, but you always seem to hit the nail on the head. So congratulations for choosing something which I think touches so many of us so deeply, and that we're also concerned about. Thank you also for putting together a really wonderful panel. I think the expertise on the panel, as you'll hear in a second, and the range of experiences that people will bring to it are going to enrich our conversation. I just wanted to make, and I know this is sort of going to be very concise, so don't worry about the schedule, but I just wanted to make 3 very brief points before I introduce our panel. First, to say that even though our title today is Families in Flight, I'm sure we're all aware of the fact that many of those fleeing are regrettably not in families. They're alone. They've either lost the rest of their family, or they've been separated from their family, or they've been sent alone by their family. So as we think about this problem, and as our colleagues address it, I think it's important to realize how fraught the social context is, not only because of the displacement, but also because of the loss of the surrounding familiar environment. The second point I wanted to make briefly is, and I'm very glad you mentioned this, Liz, that we are all so focused, rightly, on the tragedy unfolding every day in Syria and in Aleppo at the moment in particular. But of course, there are extraordinarily serious refugee crises elsewhere too, which we neglect. So South Sudan, for example, the newest member state of the United Nations, is in a state of acute conflict, and thousands are fleeing South Sudan every day, a conflict we don't hear much about. But as we think about this crisis, we need to really have a global picture in mind. And finally, I wanted to say how important it is that we have a photographer amongst us, those of us who spend most of our time with written words, because, as we all know, it was a photograph in this particular Syrian context that really shifted the compass so dramatically and really forced policymakers to get outside their policy talk and think about the humanitarian crisis, at least for a short period. So the role of photography couldn't be more critical, I think, to persuading politicians to take seriously the humanitarian impact. So let me briefly introduce altogether our speakers in the order in which they're going to be addressing us. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Noel Calhoun, who's a senior policy officer who has been working with the special advisor for the summit on addressing large numbers of refugees and migrants at the United Nations. That's quite a mouthful. But basically, she was critically involved in this big, first ever summit at the UN addressing, this large-scale migration on the 19th of September. So we're very lucky to have her insights. She now is going to be taking up the position of deputy representative of UNHCR in Ukraine, and she comes to us also as a Harvard alum with an MA and a PhD from this university. Our second speaker is a close friend and colleague, Dr. Susan Akram, who is a clinical professor of law at Boston University Law School and directs their International Human Rights Clinic. She's a must-go-to person for anyone working on refugees and has a long history of doing extraordinary work, particularly on questions relating to the Middle East, to Palestine, and to other conflicts in the area. She was recognized with the Fulbright Senior Scholar Teaching and Research Award some years ago for the research she's done. And she continues to work not only on Middle Eastern issues, but also, for example, on representing some of the people who've been detained in Guantanamo. So she has both a very impressive scholarly track record, but also is a practitioner who's sort of at the front line, so to speak. Thirdly, we have Abdulkarim Ekzayez, who is a health program manager from Save the Children's Syria Response. He's actually from, I presume he's from Aleppo, because he got his education at the University of Aleppo. And he is now based in Turkey, but obviously makes frequent trips to Syria and is involved in a set of critical campaigns, including campaigns to ensure that a higher proportion than is the case right now of Syrian children are immunized. Some of you may be aware that this drop in vaccination rates has been one of the most concerning health correlates of the conflict. So thank you for joining us. And finally, last but certainly not least, Rania Matar, our independent photographer, who was born and raised in Lebanon, and is an architect by training, but is now a full-time photographer and also a teacher at the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. She has a very long list of credits to her name of exhibitions that her work has been involved in, including some of you may have seen here at the MFA, the exhibition on women from Iran and other exhibitions dealing with Arab women. She is currently part of an exhibition called Aftermath, The Fallout of War, America and the Middle East, curated by Carol McCusker. And she's clearly been recognized for much of the work she's done, including receiving the 2011 Legacy Award at the Griffin Museum of Photography for the photographic work she's done. So thank you all so much for joining us, and perhaps you can all come up and sit next to me on the panel.
Good afternoon. I wish to thank the Radcliffe Institute for hosting an event on the issue of refugees. As I want to share with you today from my experience of the process of the preparations for the summit that was held at the United Nations just a month ago. But before that, to talk a little bit about the scope of the problem. I think we've already had the stage set for us. These numbers, 65 million displaced. That's a big number. As we heard, it's actually now 1% of the world's population. That 65 million is equivalent to the population of the United Kingdom, for example. And often you'll hear the comparison that this is the largest number of displaced persons since the Second World War. And I like to reflect on that because actually the population now is 3 times greater than what it was at the time of the Second World War. And also the economies of the rich countries in the world have not been devastated. So really this should be a challenge that we can collectively cope with, as well as our forefathers and mothers did after the Second World War. Of these 65 million, 21 million are actually refugees, meaning that they've crossed an international border. The others are displaced within their own country, including many Syrians who are displaced within their own country. And 5 million Syrians, or about a quarter of the world's refugees, are displaced from Syria. So not only are the numbers large, but the responsibility for hosting the world's refugees is not shared fairly at all. When we read the press or read the newspapers, we get the sense that there are lots of refugees coming into Europe and living in the US, but that impression is skewed because, as we've heard, the vast majority of the world's refugees are in developing countries. In fact, 8 countries in the world, all of them in Africa or Asia, host half of the world's refugees. From their perspective, this just isn't fair. Why do they end up hosting these refugees? Well, it's really an accident of geography. Because of their proximity to countries that are engulfed in conflict, they are the first responders and receiving large numbers of refugees. And they host them for a very long time. Displacement is becoming more and more protracted. Of the 21 million refugees, how many were able to actually go home last year? That's the real success. I'm a UNHCR staff person. I've been working on refugee issues for 15 years. And the big success for us is when refugees can go home and rebuild their lives. But last year, only 200,000 refugees were able to return to their homes. And over this last year, we've seen a lack of a coherent response to these increased numbers. States are reacting to refugee flows with unilateral and highly restrictive measures. They're looking for different ways to deter entry to restrict rights, to detain asylum seekers, and to put up walls that are both figurative and literal. We see that this causes immense human suffering, that it violates human rights, and we also see that it's a cause of dispute among states. And this calls out for an international solution, for multilateral approaches to solving problems. And this became even more clear in the last year, in 2015, which was a particularly horrible year for refugees, when we saw people drowning in the Mediterranean. We saw boats adrift in the Andaman Sea looking for safe harbor where people could disembark. We saw dangerous land journeys, not only in the Sahara, but closer to our home here in Central America. And then the rising problems of protracted displacement, people being displaced for 5, 10, 20, even more years. And then the impact that all of this was having on politics, particularly in Europe, but now also in the United States, where debates about resettlement of Syrians have become a matter of national concern. Over the past year, I mean, now we're coming to the end of the year, and it is a time when we can start to look back at 2016 and reflect on what has happened so far this year and where things need to go. There has been an attempt to revitalize a multilateral response to refugee movements. So what has happened over the past year? Starting in February of this year, there was a major conference to raise funds for the countries that are supporting Syrian refugees, and $12 billion was pledged at that conference for Syrian refugees and the countries that host them. The next month, the UN refugee agencies gathered states to try to persuade them to increase resettlement numbers so that more Syrian refugees could benefit from resettlement to third countries. The actual results of that were quite modest, but it takes time for countries to start a program like that, a resettlement program. And now we're starting to see, as we come toward the end of the year, that more states are pledging to start resettlement programs or to increase their numbers, something that many countries, especially Turkey, I know Karim is working in Turkey, are very interested in seeing increases. We had the World Humanitarian Summit in May of this year in Istanbul to try to improve the way that humanitarian and development workers address refugee crises. And then on the 20th of September, so the day after the UN summit, President Obama hosted what was called the Leaders Summit on Refugees. And this brought together some 52 countries that were really ready to make substantial pledges in terms of humanitarian funding, resettlement places, and education and employment opportunities for refugees. So really there has been a great deal of attention to try to improve a multilateral response to the Syrian refugee crisis. But as Jackie has mentioned, this is not only about Syria. And in fact, there can be negative repercussions if we focus only on one refugee crisis. As we were involved in the intergovernmental negotiations leading up to the summit on the 19th of September, we also heard from many countries that have been hosting refugees for a very long time and who feel that the attention to Syrian refugees is somehow putting them at a disadvantage. And that can lead to the squeezing of the protection space for refugees in those countries. So there's a recognition that we can't only just keep having pledging conferences and raising money and maybe increasing our resettlement numbers, but we need to think about longer-term issues and global trends. And on refugees, the global trends are these permanent shortfalls in humanitarian funding, the length of displacement, and the disproportionate strain on a few countries. And then there's also migration more generally. International migration is a growing global trend, but the governance structure for international migration is really in its infancy. We have better systems internationally for governing the movements of goods and services than we do for governing the movement of people. And yet, international migration has traditionally been an issue that member states do not want to discuss in the United Nations because it is considered a closely guarded attribute of national sovereignty and not something to be discussed in a multilateral forum. So the goals of the summit that we held on the 19th of September at the General Assembly was really to agree on some tools for sharing responsibility for the world's refugees and to bring the issue of migration into a multilateral forum and to start work toward a governance structure for international migration. Now, this summit occurs in an intergovernmental context, and it occurs in the General Assembly, and that institutional context is important to understand what actually happened at the summit. The General Assembly is unique as an international body in that it brings together all 193 member states with a one state, one vote principle, and decisions in the General Assembly are taken by consensus. That means you try to get everybody to agree. In the last week, I've been trying to get 20 of my colleagues to agree on a document, and I've been struggling. When you try to do that in the General Assembly with 193 member states with very diverse interests, it's quite a challenge. However, the member states agreed early on in the negotiations that they didn't want to just have the president of the General Assembly write a summary of their summit and be done with it. They actually wanted to negotiate a text. And so we spent the summer working under the leadership of the ambassadors of Jordan and Ireland. We spent the summer trying to negotiate this text among states. And they really bring very different perspectives from the states that host a lot of refugees. I'm trying to see how this clock works.
You only got 5 seconds.
5 seconds, oh dear. What we ended up with out of this very difficult negotiation was a document that underlines certain commitments to the human rights of all refugees and migrants, reaffirms the 1951 Convention for Refugees. It sets up it agrees on a comprehensive refugee response plan and sets forth the elements for that plan so that we focus not only on short-term humanitarian needs, but longer-term development needs of countries that are hosting refugees. And we have a 2-year process to agree what we're calling a global compact on refugees that will establish a fairer system for sharing responsibility among countries. We also have a similar process, an intergovernmental process on migration that we hope will lead to a global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration by 2018. And so negotiations on that are getting started in New York. But I would just end by saying that a political declaration adopted in New York it does have a legitimacy, it represents a commitment, but it's not legally binding. What it takes to make the states accountable is action on lots of different levels. And I know from working in the field that the most important action is really from the civil society organizations and from ordinary citizens who raise these issues, who make the situation of refugees very real, and press for states to live up to the commitments that they made in New York on the 19th of September. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's quite amazing to have this number of people interested in refugees. Those of us who feel like we're always talking to ourselves can be sometimes gratified by talking to others. So I'm going to move the discussion from the more political orientation to a framework of looking at the Syrian crisis from the point of view of what the law has to say about it. And as you've heard already of the global refugee total, that is convention refugees, documented now by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees as 21 million people in 2016, Syria represents 22% of that refugee population. It's the largest source country for refugees in the world today. And as of September 30th, UNHCR figures show 4.8 million total persons from Syria registered in the region, 2 million in Turkey alone, and the balance of those in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, and the rest of North Africa. Now, these figures have to be understood in context as well. Lebanon and Jordan, along with Syria, already hosted the majority of the world's Palestinian refugees for over 60 years. More than 2 million registered in Jordan, 500,000 in Lebanon, over 500,000 in Syria before the crisis in 2011. Now, 1 person in 4 in Lebanon is a refugee. While in Jordan, one of the most water-stressed countries in the world, with insufficient capacity to provide water and other basic resources to its own people, 1/4 of the population is refugees. And that bears some thinking about when we are talking about the numbers that the United States is looking at on its southern border. Despite incredible efforts to provide for the Syrian refugee influx, Jordan and Lebanon have long since exceeded capacity to absorb more refugees, and both countries quite recently closed their borders with Syria. What's particularly interesting from a legal point of view is that the main host countries to the Syrians fleeing the war had no applicable refugee and asylum frameworks in place before 2011. Lebanon and Jordan are not parties to the main international treaty governing the rights and status of refugees, the 1951 Refugee Convention. And although Egypt and Turkey are parties to the convention, they have carved out significant exceptions to its application that have affected the status of Syrians as refugees. As a result, all of these states treated Syrians as irregular migrants, short-term visitors, or in other statuses with policies that have fluctuated over time. For the first 4 years of the crisis, these governments did not conceive of incoming Syrians as refugees per se, as guests, migrants, displaced civilians, or more recently, as a result of a major change in the law in Turkey, persons under temporary protection status. As such, even without formal refugee policies, all the frontline states, until the end of last year, were extremely generous in opening their territories to the refugees, establishing almost open-door policies, together hosting the almost 4 million refugees as best they could. So what changed? These basically open-door policies towards refugees from the states in the region have become a closed-door policy towards new Syrian entrants over the last approximately a year and a half. And the key factor in this change are the policies imposed by Western states to stem the flood of refugees from moving beyond the region. As Noel discussed, billions of dollars have been raised and spent already on this crisis. As of last September, Turkey's government claimed it had spent already 5.37 billion euros of its own money, well exceeding the entire donation of the EU by then to the crisis. But all of the financial plans and a host of European and Western policies concerning refugees focus on a paradigm of containment, ensuring the refugee crisis remains in the region. Restrictive policies in Europe and the Americas, including the EU Schengen and Dublin rules, that penalize illegal border crossers and prevent access to refugee status have created extremely dangerous barriers to Syrian asylum seekers. As a result of these barriers, more than 7,500 people have died trying to make the risky sea crossing to Europe since 2014. 2 children drown on average every day in the Mediterranean or Aegean trying to reach Europe. The extremely generous policies that Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and even Egypt had put in place at the start of the crisis began rapidly reversing as a direct result of the failure of states outside the region to share responsibility for a portion of the refugee flow. While these countries are hosting over 4 of the 5 million Syrian refugees, the EU has asked the European states to pledge no more than 160,000 resettlement slots for refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Eritrea. And so far, no more than 270,000 asylum applications have been submitted by Syrians all across Europe. And resettled refugees and asylum seekers in the EU represent far less than 10% of the Syrian refugee population. The US administration's recent announcement that it would accept an additional 10,000 Syrian refugees this year, though welcome, is also an extremely small expansion to the US's 70,000 yearly global refugee ceiling and contributes little to relieving the crisis. The latest EU-Turkey agreement to send refugees back who survived the risky journey by sea or land from Turkey to Europe with a €3 billion financial incentive and a quote-unquote refugee exchange plan is only the latest of the Western policies of containment. The EU-Turkey agreement, the combined Dublin-Schengen rules, and pushback policies in the Eastern European states are major elements of the containment paradigm currently driving the Middle East refugee dynamic. Meanwhile, major barriers in US refugee law, such as the overexpansive material support for terrorism bars that prevent thousands of legitimate refugees from being admitted to this country, mean that hundreds of eligible Syrians are waiting in limbo after being granted refugee recognition in the host states, while the multi-agency vetting process in the US wends its way to conclusion. The main thrust, then, of these policies is not protection of the vulnerable migrants and refugees who are the subjects of it, but a solidifying of this containment paradigm on which the US and the EU have operated since the migrant and refugee crisis in the Middle East made its way to Europe and beyond. In brief, the policy's major focus is to make sure the refugees and migrants currently hosted in the millions by the neighboring states remain there and are barred by whatever means necessary from leaving the region. This is exactly the opposite of the thrust of the purpose of the treaties that bind the EU and the wider community of European and most Western states. The primary and, of course, most important international legal obligations towards refugees arise from the 1951 Refugee Convention and its companion 1967 Protocol, as one or both of these instruments bind all the states in Europe, the US, as well as Turkey. The essential elements of the Refugee Convention are the obligation not to return a refugee to a place where she risks persecution, non-refoulement, the obligation of each state party to provide fair access to asylum procedures to refugees on a non-discriminatory basis, and the prohibition against collective expulsion. These elements are expanded under European regional instruments, such as the EU Charter, the Civil and Political Rights Treaty, the European Convention on Human Rights, and decisions of the two European courts, the Strasbourg and the Luxembourg courts. These courts have further articulated that collective expulsion includes when a state removes refugees and migrants from its territory in any manner that fails to provide them with access to fair procedures for international protection. The prohibition against collective expulsion also includes removing persons on the basis of their national or ethnic identity through pro forma proceedings or without access to counsel or where no appeal is available from a removal decision. Focusing further on Europe, under EU laws and regulations, there are additional obligations on member states in situations of emergency, where there's mass influx of displaced persons. EU states must provide temporary protection against return, regardless of internal EU arrangements such as Dublin and Schengen. European states, parties to the European Convention, are prohibited from sending refugees to other states where the individuals would be at risk of return to persecution or violations of their convention rights. It is well accepted that international responsibility and burden sharing of refugees is today a legal obligation on all states parties to the Refugee Convention. In spite of all this, the way forward is well known. Under prior international practice, all states parties to the Refugee Convention regime, not just European states, should be participating in a UNHCR-led proposal for a comprehensive plan of action that sets out numbers of refugees that each state agrees to accept, the various kinds of status that participating states are willing to provide, minimum standards of benefits to be granted the refugees, and fair refugee status determinations in all states. Such CPAs have been negotiated in mass refugee flows all over the world from the 1970s onwards, and well-established guidelines and criteria exist as solid precedent to resolve this current crisis. These are legal obligations and are the key to providing a real and durable solution to the millions of individual human beings forced from home and victimized by a crisis not of their making.
Thank you all for showing interest, and thank you for Radcliffe Institute for giving this platform to try to build a common understanding of the cause of this refugee crisis. Whenever I'm invited to talk about Syria, I sit to prepare some talking points, but within minutes, the nostalgia takes me there, where I miss my room, I miss my library, my diary, which should be sitting somewhere under the rubble now. Each single family in Syria has lost either a family member or a house or belongings. Syria has lost 700,000 people were killed out of 23 million of their population, which means each single family, especially in the opposition-controlled areas, they lost a family member. However, as I have just 10 minutes, I will try to go as fast as I can, and bear with me if I was very fast. So why now we are talking about this refugee crisis? Why now, and starting from 2015? The answer is obvious, because some refugees arrived to Europe. This refugee started in 2012 and 2013. Syrians were daily fleeing out of country, and we heard the numbers from Susan and Noel about the numbers in the region. But the problem that some countries, some people, maybe they don't feel the suffer or the pain till the risk knock their door. It is a long trip. It is a long, risky trip. So Syrians, they go from Syria through the Turkey border, which could be risky because Turkey has closed their border since 2015. And most families and personals, they're crossing illegally. And just in July, a few months ago, a family was crossing of 15 family members. 11 of them were killed by the Turkish army while they were trying to cross illegally to Turkey. And then from Turkey to Greece, crossing the sea, which is the most risky part. And then there are a lot of barriers here till they arrive to their final destinations. And we saw a lot of photos of families drowning in the sea. 2,500 people drowned in the Mediterranean in this crisis. And we should ask ourselves why. It seems that the conditions they are escaping from are worse than drowning in the sea. And it's not just the only displacement. There are other displacement, could be even more in numbers. The internal displacement, people in Syria on daily basis, on weekly basis, we have massive population movements escaping from violence within Syria. We have a lot of ad hoc camps next to the Turkish border and everywhere in Syria, containing at least 300,000 people or more. These camps are completely not organized because there is no official presence of the UNHCR or international organizations to organize these camps. So it has the minimum, even not have the minimum level of shelter conditions. And most these families are women and children. Some families, they had to move several times till they arrived to their final destination. This family we've met in Idlib, they moved 4 times from Damascus to rural Damascus, and then to Homs, and then to northern Hama, till they arrived to this school in Idlib, where they are sharing the classroom with other families. But look at her having some hope looking into her child's eyes. The question is why? And the reason is obvious, because of the Syrian crisis. But could we define what's happening in Syria? It is a civil war or public revolutions? We have a lot of answers. We don't have till the moment a common understanding of what's happening in Syria. And maybe because of the media, maybe because of the political complications, I will try as best as we can to build a common understanding quickly, a neutral one, as much as I can. So this map is for Syria currently. Each color refers to a different party. And within each color, there are different sub-parties or different groups. The red one is the regime, where they control the main cities. The green one is the oppositions, and there are hundreds of fractions. The black one is ISIL, and the yellow one is the courts. And here, the blue one here is the Turks, because even the Turks now, they are in Syria. To understand maybe the crisis quickly, to review the timeline of this crisis. The spark started in March 2011 when some children from Dar'a, they wrote some statements against the regime on the wall, and the children were punished by the intelligence agencies. People went in demonstrations against this, and these demonstrations spread out of the country. This photo is from Hama, but the response from the intelligence agencies against these protesters were really violent. So that's why some commanders and soldiers from the Syrian army, they refused to participate in these practices against the protesters. So they established in 2011 something called the Free Syrian Army. In 2013, the Free Syrian Army expanded and controlled a lot of rural areas. But the regime, they are still controlling the main capitals. And the courts, they have some process in their areas. In 2014, the situation became to be complicated because there were a lot of parties involved from the regime side, mainly Hezbollah from Lebanon, maybe some Iraqi Shia militia from Iraq and Iran. And again, the Turkish border from the other side, the oppositions, brought a lot of jihadists to fight because the war starting from this point maybe had some sectorial perspectives because some of the parties participated in this conflict. And here we have in 2014 the first presence of ISIL, but in limited areas. In 2015, ISIL has expanded a lot. 50% of Syria was controlled by ISIL. The regime shrank to the main cities, and the oppositions maybe like they selected or they were given Idlib as the main hub. And the courts, they are in the same areas. In 2016, here we go, we have more external parties. We have Russia, they have boots on the ground with the regime. Iran sent boots on the ground, in addition to Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias. And from the other side, the US with the international coalition, they hit areas in ISIS. The US, they support the courts and they are fighting against ISIS. So that's why courts, they expanded a little bit. But because because of the tension between Turkey and the courts, the Turks expanded to have some lands here. And there are many other parties, maybe they don't have boots on the ground, but they are still involved in this crisis. So it is not a Syrian to Syrian conflict. Just recently, Aleppo cities, which is the second largest city in Syria, has completely besieged by the regime, putting approximately 300,000 people under besiegement in this area. They don't have any access to any life services. Just quick, I will say quick statements, and if it's true, raise your hand, please, okay? About the besieged areas. The regime allows injured people and medical cases to get out of the besieged area seeking medical help. Is it true? No, it is not true. A lot of people, they die in the besieged areas because they cannot seek medical help. Food, water, fuel are not allowed to get in at any point. It is true. Medical supplies are excluded from the restrictions. No, it is not excluded. Even medical supplies, the hospitals now, they are suffering from, especially in Aleppo, from having no medical supplies. Aid workers and UN agencies are allowed to enter besieged areas, but they don't enter, ensuring their staff safety. Seems you have good understanding about the besieged areas. It is not true. They are not allowed to enter the besieged areas. It's not just the besiegement. There are daily targeting of civilian infrastructure. Just in July and August, the health cluster reported more than 30 hospitals being destroyed either partially or completely by the airstrikes. Just in one night, in 24th of July, 5 hospitals out of the 10 functioning hospitals in Aleppo were destroyed. And just to imagine yourself in this hospital, quickly. This is one hospital in Aleppo. So while the patients are getting treatment, the hospital is being targeted. And this hospital was targeted 3 times in July just. And this hospital went out of service completely. Just quickly, because we're running out of time. Education, the same story. This hospital is our Safe Children Supported Hospital in Kafr Takharim. It was targeted 3 times. Each time we were rehabilitating the school, and the school was targeted again and again. So why people flee out of Syria? In my opinion, 3 reasons. Violence, which we talked about. Basic life services. If you don't have water, food, medical help, for sure you will not stay. And personal documentation, which is an interesting one, because people in the opposition areas, they don't have access to the government and they don't have any representations. So they cannot get like birth registrations, death registration, passports. So they seek asylum to have kind of documents showing their identity. And then solutions. Is the solution by asking countries to absorb more? I hope it's just the temporary solution, because Syria is losing their people, doctors, teachers, who are supposed to build the country again. We were able to do a lot, and we are able to do a lot in Syria, vaccination, hospitals, schools, even without electricity on the candles, and some spaces among the violence for children to play. But we were not able to fund all our humanitarian response plan. And we do have to have a lot of advocacy to build this common understanding of the Syrian crisis, and finally to strengthen the Syrian civil society, because it's the best way to having the structure of this community again. Hopefully, again, later will be a merge between the civil society in the regime area and the civil society in the opposition area. And we had many good examples of associations where we are able to establish this Idlib Health Directorate and Idlib Governorate, managing all these health centers, and a lot of Syrian NGOs managing up to 23 million operations in Syria. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here. I feel like I'm with all these scholars, and I'm just a photographer. And so instead of my research, basically, is really my personal impressions. I'm originally from Lebanon, from Palestinian parents, and I came to the US to go to college, study architecture. I really became a photographer after September 11 because I wanted to tell a different story of the Middle East. It felt like the news was always them and us, and I'm like, I am them and us, and it was very personal to me. But so I've been focusing in my work mainly on women and girls, and I'm focusing on our universality and sameness. But in 2014, way before we all heard about the refugee crisis, the Syrian crisis in Europe and internationally, Lebanon was dealing with that. And I really was not actually looking for it or anything, but I was walking on the streets of Beirut, and it felt like there was Syrian kids just about at every corner, begging for money, selling Kleenex or shining shoes, and there was something very utterly disturbing about it. And I mean, Lebanon is a country of about 4.5 million people. They say now there's maybe 1.5 million refugees, some of them not registered, so my numbers might not be right, but this is the perception. Lebanon has its own issues economically and politically. There hasn't been a president in over 2 years. So people, even though many people are really opening their doors and helping the refugees, people are also fed up. So they make them move away from their storefronts and ask them to go step somewhere else. And I started talking to one boy, and he was 14, which is in 2014, this was the age of my son at that point, and he looked like my son. And there was something so disturbing, like this kid should be at school. That's not him, but I'm making the intro to this project. And this kid should be at school and not on the street. And I realized that they were happy to be paid attention to. So I started photographing the kids individually. And I feel like, you know, when you hear about the millions, it almost becomes abstract and unattainable as a number. So I'm trying to photograph each kid by himself or herself and to give them their identity and their dignity back. So I'm photographing them just like in all of my work, I focus on girls and women. I'm photographing them with the same focus and attention that I would give anybody else. What was interesting is I found as well that all these kids were standing because they were pushed away. I mean, they wanted to be in the areas of Beirut where there would be traffic and money, but they were always often pushed away from the storefronts. And there was something very fascinating that they often stood in front of these walls that were covered with graffiti or billboards or different announcements. And it felt like these walls were breathing history, and they had all these layers of different layers of history. And for me, these kids became just an anonymous layer on these walls. And there was something very sad about it. So I'm going to go through the photos and show some of them. I mean, I have their names and their ages. They were telling me their stories, but I have to say all the stories sadly blended into one big story. They were incredibly similar. Most of them would say the father's either dead or fighting. They didn't even know which side he's fighting with. But the mothers were either begging on some other street corner or at home staying with some family members. So these kids have been basically on the streets, as far as I know, since 2014, probably earlier. That's when I started kind of doing this project. And I found them extremely dignified when I photographed them. I'm just going to tell the story of, this is brand new from this past summer. I was actually running in the morning, and I passed that young woman who I found stunningly beautiful. And I don't know how much you could tell in the photo. Her face was peeling, completely burned from the sun. So I stopped and started talking to her, and I decided that I wanted to go back. I asked her where she would be, and I went back, got the car, got my camera, got her sunscreen, and looked for her. And so I wanted to take her back to where I had found her, because I found her in a different spot. And she got in the car with me, which in and by itself I found even more disturbing. And I told her, you know what, I'm okay, I'm a mom, I have a daughter your age, but you should not get into people's car. I get the chills when I tell that story. And I realized how vulnerable all these kids are. So I'm gonna go through them because I also realized, and if you see, oh, it's not in this one, I have another one of her where you could actually see the money. This is the shoe shining equipment that they carry around all day. And this girl's name was Maya, which is the name of my daughter. So I have to say, and I saw her again a year later, which made me happy and sad because it meant she's still on the street, but it also meant that she was okay. And then I started realizing, I don't know if I'm going too fast, I kind of want to make it through them. Here you could see the money in her hand, and I don't know if you could see it up there, but she's holding the money in her hand. This is then I realized there was something that some of these Syrian refugees were actually even staying in Palestinian refugee camps, which in and by itself, I'm going to show some of those photos because this was the focus of my earlier work. The refugee camps are really in very dire, terrible condition. And as somebody said before me, there's about 500,000 Palestinian refugees, but this is a very different story because over there now it's like third and fourth generations that are being born. But now, so there are some Syrian refugees in the Palestinian refugee camp, making the whole thing a little more complicated. So this is what I'm showing for that series. But as we're talking about refugees, and now the reason why Lebanon did not want to build camps for the Syrian refugees is when they did build camps for the Palestinian refugees, the camps became permanent. So what was supposed to be a temporary structure, now 68 years later, these camps are there, they're overpopulated, and they're in pretty terrible conditions. So this is actually the ID card of this woman, and you could see how young she was when she became a refugee. And this is the only piece of paper she has. So she does not have a citizenship. Her paper is her refugee card. And I'm just showing the different generations. So I'm going to go through those. This is in the Palestinian refugee camp, and these are Palestinian refugees. But I guess it's people make a life. So the difference is these kids now, there's a system. There's a school within the camps. So at least they're going to school, and the structure, the permanency of it made it that there is kind of a life that's not normal, but that at least the kids are getting some kind of education and they're not on the streets. And for me, when I started this work, it kind of was really for me to focus on the universality as well. Like, you know, at the end of the day, she's a mom and she's nursing her baby, and there's nothing more universal than that. And here I'm showing the two girls. This is kind of their house, and here you have the older ladies. It's like, for me, it's like the girls are going to turn into that. So I'm just showing a couple of those because I did work on younger prepubescent girls, and I was photographing girls. I was inspired by my daughter. I was photographing girls in the US, and I decided I wanted to include refugee girls, Palestinian girls, Syrian girls, and girls from Lebanon, because there's the universality of growing up. And so I'm showing some of those, and it's important for me to put a face on them and to see the beauty that these refugees are girls before anything else. And this, I'm doing a project on mothers and daughters, and this is a brand new picture from this summer. And for me, it's like if you see the nails on the daughters, every nail is different. It's like she's 20, she's like any 20-year-old, her dreams are ahead of her, and this is her mom, and you'll be shocked when you find out how old she is. The mom is 43 years old. I'm 9 years older than this woman, and she was treating me like one of her daughters. So there was something about the permanency of life as a refugee where at some point your dreams become, the reality sinks in. I believe this is the last one. Oh, sorry. So now I'm trying, again, it's about the passing of time. So this is a 12-year-old girl in Palestinian refugee camp. This is now that same girl 4 years later. And that, again, this is Danya at 9, and this is, again, her at 13. So I'm just trying to show that, you know, time goes by and life is still the same for many people. I'm just showing this print. This is a Syrian refugee girl, and I felt like for me, one way of trying to give back, I work with a gallery, and we decided to make an edition of 50 of this print, and all the money that we make off this print is going to the Akram Foundation, which is they do admirable work, and they're based in Chicago, and they've been helping Syrian refugees. So I thought I would just show that. And I'm sorry if I went too fast, but this clock is haunting me here. So.
Well, is this working? Yes. Well, thank you for those very compelling presentations. I'm sorry we had to rush you. Each of you could have taken up the whole time we have, and we would have loved it. But in the meantime, we've really learned so much from you. So I just wanted to start with a couple of general questions, really. and then maybe one or two pointed questions to some of you, and then open the floor for discussion. So the first observation and question is this. As Susan said, it's ironic that the countries that are doing the most to shelter, protect, and help Syrian refugees are countries that have not signed the Refugee Convention, that have no legal obligation to provide the hospitality that they're providing. So I wonder what that says about our international architecture and what it says about how we should think moving forward about the agreements that we are seeking to develop and to undertake. And in particular, when we think about increasing resettlement and when we think about moving towards a new architecture for migration, what does the current situation teach us? And maybe, Noel, I'll start with you, because I know you've thought a lot about the lack of a proper framework. But what does this glaring reality tell us? Here we have countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic that have ratified the Refugee Convention. It was a necessary condition of them joining the EU. They are openly saying they don't want any refugees, they don't want any Muslims. And at the same time, we have countries like Lebanon and Jordan, as we've heard, that have not only been hosting refugees for decades, but that actually haven't signed on to the international treaty that provides the basis for protection. So what does that make you think about in terms of next steps for legal architecture?
I'm sorry, is that, oh, it's on, okay. 148 states have signed the 1951 Refugee Convention, and it's true that many states, especially surrounding Syria, have not signed. That is mainly to do historically with the unresolved issue of the refugees from Palestine. And I think we should, Rania has spoken about the refugees from Palestine, that unresolved refugee situation for 67 years is a major issue within the Middle East, and it is a barrier for many of those states to accede to the Refugee Convention. However, that being said, we see that many of the states and in many General Assembly resolutions, we talk about the extremely generous approach of many countries who host refugees, albeit not being signatories to the Refugee Convention. The idea is really to build on the convention and to not to dismantle it, because it has actually stood the test of time. It has offered protection to millions, but to build on it and really focus on this issue of responsibility sharing. It is mentioned, this concept of international cooperation is in the 1951 convention. It's mentioned in the preamble that we need international cooperation to alleviate the burden of hosting refugees, but the systems for doing that, we've had, I think as Susan mentioned, different comprehensive refugee responses to the Vietnamese refugee crisis, to the Central American refugee crisis, but we need to do that not on an ad hoc basis, but on a much more systematic basis, and that's what we're working toward. I mean, we didn't get all the way there in a summer of negotiations, especially in the summer of 2016, where the political climate was really not very propitious or auspicious for the negotiations. But we have now a commitment of states to work toward that. And I think the challenge for all of us and for all of you is to keep the pressure on. And we have political space, we have an opening to work toward a better responsibility sharing. We need the policy ideas, we need the focus and commitment to get all the way there.
Thank you so much. Susan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think that really two responses that I have to that, picking up on what Noel said. The first is the observation of how interdependent both refugee crises are one to the other, and how interdependent all states are on each other's response to a refugee crisis. And I think states that continue to pretend that they can insulate themselves and somehow push a crisis onto another state, even a neighboring state, are really fooling themselves. I think that time has gone, and the pressure needs to be on reinserting in the political dialogue the legal dialogue. Because you hear all of the politicians talking about, well, we don't have to do this or we don't have to do that, but in fact, they have bound themselves to legal obligations. And so that must mean something. And it is, of course, up to civil society to hold our own states accountable to their legal obligations. And I think the second piece is the question of enforcement. That plagues all of international law, but it particularly plagues refugee law, and there is a provision in the Refugee Convention that permits states to take violations of the convention against another state to the International Court of Justice. Surprise, surprise, there's never been such a case brought to the International Court of Justice, but perhaps it's time. And I've been privy to conversations among refugee law adjudicators, and many of them talk about the need for a separate international refugee tribunal. And so that's coming from adjudicators, which I think is extremely interesting. So on the one hand, this interdependence, we've been talking about the fact that all of the Middle Eastern states are persistent objectors to the refugee regime because of the experience with the Palestinians. So that experience has colored their attitude towards all later coming refugees. And so without dealing with the Palestinian question, it isn't going to be possible to change those states' attitude towards the refugee regime. So I think moving the discussion from the political to the legal, putting the legal obligations front and center, and then trying to address some of these major gaps that would make the protection regime that we have much more robust.
But I wonder if I could just press you a little bit. You said in your remarks that there's an obligation to establish a comprehensive plan of action, and you rightly, refer to the history from Vietnam and so on. But why is there such an obligation? Where does that obligation inhere in, and who is in a position to impose it? My sense is that there's extremely little political will, not even to agree a compact of the kind of fairly, bland version that was set out in the Secretary General's background paper for the 19th of September meeting. So where would we get the political will for a CPA, and how should we as kind of concerned members of civil society be trying to build towards that? So any thoughts on that?
So that's really two questions. Okay. And one is the political will, the other is where's the legal obligation come from? And of course, in international law, one of the strongest sources of law is customary law, that is the practice of states. And so we can see responsibility sharing as a sort of complex set of obligations that have become the practice of states in major refugee crises, starting from the 1970s, CPA in the Indo-Chinese situation, building on that in the later 70s and 80s, Sarefka, and the Great Lakes Comprehensive Plan of Action, and then the very recent one in the former Soviet Union, the CIS Comprehensive Plan of Action. So we are actually finding states responding in more and more sophisticated ways, and they're building on formal legal obligations, not just from the Refugee Convention, but from, for example, the temporary protection norm, which has now become formalized almost everywhere. In the US, we have temporary protected status built into our Immigration Nationality Act. In Europe, we have the EU-wide directive on temporary protection that should, by the way, be triggered by the Syrian crisis, because it's precisely this kind of crisis that should trigger the directive. So it's a multi-layered, complex response that I would argue is now formalized as state practice, and I think it's customary international law. Now, where should it come from? Like most of the other comprehensive plans of actions, they've been driven by the UNHCR by putting a formula on the table and then pressing states to begin a rather complex short and longer term admission process and dividing up responsibility in that way. So I think it's not a mystery. We have to generate the political will, but I think the legal obligation is now, at this point, quite clear.
Let me switch a little bit from the policy and legal to the more human and humanitarian side of things. So, Abdulkarim, I wanted to ask you, you showed some of the images of the bombing of hospitals, and several of us here just actually in Bosnia the last few days have been to talks given by doctors from Syria documenting unbelievable attacks. I mean, according to one surgeon, every single hospital in Syria has been bombed at least once. And he also said that now people in the rebel groups or in the opposition groups are saying to the doctors and to the medical personnel, please don't come near us, because if you come near us, we're definitely going to be a target. So how do you explain that? Why do you think that's happening? I mean, I just be interested to know. It's so, not only is it such a fundamental and gross violation of international norms, it's also, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's pretty unprecedented. This degree of willful destruction of bona fide medical services that are neutrally administering medical help to both sides in the conflict, admitting anybody who needs medical care. How do you, as someone who's actually going in and out of Syria, dealing with the humanitarian guys, how do you explain this? What do people say about this specific targeting?
Actually, starting from the beginning of the crisis, there were enormous pressure on the medical staff from both sides. So starting from 2011, where some medical staff, they were trying to provide help to the people from the other side, they were receiving a lot of pressure from the regime side. And at the same time, medical staff in the opposition, they are receiving pressure. They are under enormous pressure from specific fraction groups if they treated other people from other groups. So it's the concept is there since the beginning of the crisis. And maybe recently, especially in 2016, we are seeing this increased targeting. It seems that a lot of targeting of the civilian infrastructure are linked to the military tactics of all the parties involved in this conflict. Because it seems whenever they besieged any area, then they will start to target the civilian infrastructure, and mainly hospitals and medical staff, to push people to flee out of these areas, and then they can have some demographic changes. And unfortunately, that's what happened in several areas, in Homs and Bab Amr in 2014, and the same happened this year. 3 population movement or forced movements happened from Al-Zabadani, from Muaddamiya, and recently from Al-Wa'ar in Homs. So they besiege the area and then target the civilian infrastructure. So people, they don't have options. They should leave. And especially the medical services, because it is essential for the people who stayed to have medical help, because they are under daily targeting by airstrikes. So without having medical services, they are more likely to flee out of their home. So these are the interpretation that we heard from the people in Syria, that it seems that it is like a target specifically within besieged areas.
Noel, did you have any insight on this aspect? I mean, from the UNHCR perspective, because it's such a fundamental violation of international law that just dispassionately, even in other very bitter conflicts, this kind of targeting hasn't happened. So I just wondered, is this something that's been taken up, even within the UN as kind of experts are meeting, or has it gone beyond that point?
Yeah, and what we haven't talked about today is that a part of any comprehensive solutions has to be a solution to the war. I mean, there is not the former High Commissioner of Refugees, who's just been and we're proud, very proud he's now the new Secretary General. Antonio Guterres will start his term in January. But I mean, he's kept saying there is no humanitarian solution to the war in Syria. There is only a political solution, and peace is the only solution. And what you can say about these horrible violations of international humanitarian law, and is that as Karim has already said, that it's a major cause of displacement. It is, it is targeted toward increasing displacement, and we can build better systems of receiving refugees in neighboring countries. We can increase resettlement, but we're not going to solve the Syrian refugee problem in that way. We need to find peace in Syria, as difficult as that is.
Thank you. Rania, I wanted to ask you about, your really compelling and beautiful pictures. You said that you started photographing the children when you realized that they welcomed the attention in a way. But there are concerns that, many of us have about the way in which children are always used to highlight and sometimes to sensationalize, tragedy. And of course, the technical question is, how does one get consent? Is there a parent who's giving consent? What happens to the images? But the broader question is, what is the role that these images then play in the world, and how are they controlled? And I'm sure you thought about this. I'd love to have just your reflections on, the kind of, I guess it's a tension, the pluses and the minuses. Obviously, they're compelling and they involve us, but at the same time, there's a sense of maybe some sort of ethical concerns. So I just love to hear your thoughts on that.
For me, I photographed them like I photographed my own kids, and I felt like it was important for me to give them a face. So it was done with a good intention, and I didn't think beyond that, I have to say. I'm not like CNN asked me to put them on TV. I didn't agree because the kids did not want to have their pictures on TV. So I am trying to use it for the right reason and in the right context. I have an exhibit. I'm not paid to do those images. This was doing it because I want to do it. I wasn't hired by anybody. So I'm very careful. They're protected by my copyright. I'm very careful where they end up. And I'm only showing them within the context of my work. Now, in the Middle East in general, I dumped the consent a long time ago because asking people for consent makes people freak out like they're signing their life away. And I realized it's a very different culture. And once the trust is established, this was more important than giving them a piece of paper and signing it. As soon as I gave them the paper, the whole trust and the relationship was altered. So in the camps, I've never asked for anything. I go back, I give them pictures, I work with the NGOs. I don't want to have an exchange of money because I don't want it to be about paying for the image. So I give some money to the NGOs, and I tell them I want them to help the few families that I built relationships with over the year. Now, this is coming from the right intentions, and I'm trying to be as protective of where the images end up as I can.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. It's an interesting question because, of course, as scholars and academics, we're very circumscribed in what we can do. We have
absolutely.
to get permission
and
from...
then, and the kids, really, I felt like most people did not, like one time I was photographing, I'm almost embarrassed to tell that story, but you have to put it in the context of people are fed up in Lebanon. But I was photographing that boy, and I was kind of in the middle of the street. It was a small alley, and this guy came speeding toward me. So I kind of jumped backwards, and I yelled in Arabic, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "You deserve it. Why are you photographing those dogs?" So it was... Most people do not treat them like that, but I realized for me, somebody to treat them with respect and pay attention to them and talk to them, and I'd go buy them candy and water. It's about building a relationship. Like, they would be happy to see me when I came back the next day. So.
Oh, thank you. The last question I'm going to ask, and maybe people can start thinking about their questions while I do. is about the question that several of you raised about documents. So, Abdulkarim, you said that one of the reasons people leave is because they don't have a relationship with the government. And Susan, you said that people are irregular, illegal, they don't have a legal status. And we know from the work that many of us are engaged in that many of the children lack birth registration. Now many of the Syrian children are actually becoming stateless, which has lifelong consequences. So why can't the sort of advances that we've made with new technology be used to create a simple mechanism, not beyond kind of the intelligence of many people in this town, to create a simple mechanism of having a fingerprint and a date and a photograph? And are these are people trying to think about this? Because it's been talked about for at least a year and a half, this idea of really ensuring that children are not undocumented, that children are not stateless, that children do have some record of their identity and ideally of their birth. Do either of you, maybe in particular, or know whether any of this is happening? And if not, why not?
Should I start just describing the situation in Syria and in Turkey? It is not about technology actually at all, because even in Turkey they do have the technology, but they struggle in the birth registration, for example. And if, like example, I have a daughter in Turkey, I struggled a lot to have a birth certificate. And if I don't have a birth certificate, I cannot get the Syrian nationality even. So even in Turkey, there is a problem related to the personal documentation or the personal state. In Syria, there were some ideas and initiatives by the local councils. And the local councils, they are kind of ad hoc structures in each village and each city in Syria. They are from the local people, kind of representing their people, like the village and the village itself, and trying to provide the services there. So some of these local councils, they started recording, especially the birth and death and properties and some other information, but actually they don't have the support. There were maybe one project through the Assistant Coordination Unit supported, I think, by OFDA maybe at some point, or other donors, to support the local councils to do kind of governance structure to them. But I think they didn't receive the proper support to do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please line up behind the microphone. And as Dean Cohen said, please just give us your name and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I'm Hala Zrekat, one of the Radcliffe Fellows. I am Jordanian by origin, but live in Australia. The question I would like to ask is, what's the panel view on the position of the Gulf region in terms of opening their doors to the refugees in Syria or Palestine? The reason I ask about that is I myself quite often ask this question. Why should Europe, America, not Australia at the moment, they're closing their borders, I think, but why should we open the doors for refugees when you have the money and the space in the Gulf region? So,
thank you very much. Yeah, let's take one more question, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. Yes.
It's an interesting match to the last question. My name is Cheryl Hamilton. I'm the Director of Partner Engagement at the International Institute. We resettle 640 refugees here in the region. And I have one request, which is we just found out, of course, we're going to resettle 25,000 more refugees, but there was no financial increase provided. So actually we have less money to do the same and almost twice as much work. But my interesting question is, I really admired how you said that we don't talk enough about all refugee populations. We're resettling right now only 6 Syrian families, but we have 55% of our caseload are Congolese. How do we advocate well on behalf of all refugee populations? Not ignoring the amazing work you're doing today.
Thank you so much. So, Noel, would you like to take one of those questions?
Yeah, I would just underline really the importance of the point that you've just made about advocating well on behalf of all refugee populations. You do perceive, especially at the UN, a kind of a jealousy that my refugee situation is getting more attention than yours, and that's not just a petty. That's not just a petty issue, because it's an issue about funding. I mean, we have very, very critical underfunding of many refugee situations. And it's now about the sense that if you sort of put your refugees under pressure, that's a good way to get more financial support. And we don't want to go down that road where in order for a country to get more support for its refugees, it needs to threaten to send them back to their own country, for example. Refugees, there needs to be some principle of equity, and so as much as we need to talk about the situation in Syria, I think in all of these contexts we need to keep also bringing up situations like what's going on in Congo or South Sudan, or not to forget about Afghanistan and Somalia. Those poor people have been refugees for 20, 30 years, and then the Palestinians as well. So it is very important to keep all of these issues together because that helps to improve the protection for all.
Thank you. Susan, do you want to tackle the question about the Gulf?
Yes, and actually the Gulf states, the UAE, has agreed to take a few thousand, I think it's no more than 45 or something thousand Syrians. And I don't know the details of what the actual status is that they're planning to give because they're also not parties to the Refugee Convention. So it would have to be by memorandum of agreement with the UNHCR, what the parameters of that agreement would be. But I think you make a really good point, which is that in most of the discussions, the Gulf has been left off. And I think because of this sense that the Gulf has never been welcoming to refugees and has a huge problem of migrants, migrant workers, who have been struggling to get some kind of status and basic rights for themselves as workers. So that's sort of an ongoing struggle with the Gulf. But I think it's a really good point, and there needs to be much more attention paid. Now, the Gulf states are paying a lot of money to Turkey in particular, but also to Jordan for the camps and for the refugees there. But of course, that's not a substitute for actually accepting.
Can I add something?
Rania.
I think also, sadly, religion plays a big role in the Middle East right now. Palestinian Christians were given a citizenship. Palestinian Muslims ended up in the refugee camps, and I think now a lot of Lebanese Shia are not given visas anymore to go work in the Gulf countries, in like Dubai and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and so there's a whole other layer of dirty politics and religion that's playing in that as well.
Thank you. Yes, next question, please.
Hi, my name is Anna. I was just wondering, so at the beginning of this whole panel, it was mentioned that a refugee crisis couldn't really become possible until the creation of the nation state. And so I was just wondering, and this isn't directed towards anyone in particular, but does today's international refugee crisis speak to the constructedness of the nation state and that borders are so porous, or does a state's lack of a response or desire to protect the nation state speak to its solidarity and solidity, rather?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and we'll have one more question.
I'm Abigail English, and I'm a former Radcliffe Fellow. In your opening remarks, Jackie, you mentioned that many of the refugees are not part of families or are traveling on their own, and so many of them are children or adolescents. And I'm wondering whether any of you could comment from a humanitarian or a human rights or a legal perspective what the potentials, opportunities are for protecting those young people who are traveling on their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Okay, so the first question was really, what does this refugee crisis say about the viability or the continuing of the nation state and the notion that every state has its own sovereign right to protect its borders, given how, in a way, borders have become more porous? So is this kind of signaling some sort of change, or is this signaling, just a retrenchment in terms of a humanitarian commitment, I suppose? But would anybody like to tackle that question? Okay, Noel,
maybe
go
I'll
ahead.
tackle that. If there's change, it says the Arabs would say shway shway. It's very slow. Because, I mean, look, in the negotiations in New York, very clear that states want to maintain control of their borders, and this is the political environment in which many we're living in, where there's more and more talk about border control. And this association of people coming in with all sorts of ills. But at the same time, we did have the moment, which, I mean, it's very small, but in agreement that now we're going to discuss migration at the United Nations. Before, that topic was actually taboo at the UN, that we're going to bring the International Organization for Migration into the United Nations. Before it was a separate, the UN didn't have a migration organization, so that's a step. And that we're going to have an international conference on migration. Now, the idea to have an intergovernmental process on migration, that goes back at least to 1994, and member states would never agree to it. So the fact that they agreed to it now suggests some recognition that migration isn't something that states manage on their own. It's something that needs to be governed within the international system. So maybe a little bit of a shift, but not a big philosophical transformation at this point.
Thank you, yeah. The question about children, and particularly unaccompanied children, and what protections are available and what protections are being provided. Does anybody want to address that?
I'm going to address what I saw in Lebanon. The kids were very vulnerable. I don't think there was, as far as I could tell, but again, it's something from there was no protection whatsoever. I was told they come in a big truck and they get dropped off early in the morning and they expected to just bring money back. I mean, the 5-year-old would give me a name and would come back, and I heard her talking to another guy, and she had told me her name was Samira, and now she's talking to the guy, and it's like, okay, bye, Aya. And I told her, oh, you told me your name was Samira. And she whispers, she's like, I'm lying to him. And obviously she's lying to me, but I realized they learned to be very street smart. And she was 5. Like, they felt extremely vulnerable to me. The girls were very beautiful and very vulnerable. And the boys, I felt, was as vulnerable. This is the next generation, and these kids are not being educated. And I worry about them on the street for too long. It ended up being recruited in the wrong places.
Maybe
and they're easy targets.
Just quickly address that from, 2 aspects. One is what legal protections are available. And the second is it's actually becoming an enormous crisis. We've started a project on the pushbacks from Greece and Bulgaria this year with my students. And my Greek colleagues have been documenting that there are thousands of migrants who are disappearing. After arriving on these terrible voyages, they're somehow disappearing. So the NGOs are reaching some of them, and then they can't find them. So that's an enormous issue, and Greece has been dealing with detentions, and they've been detaining minors. Bulgaria also is detaining minors. But so the problem of tracking these kids and having a mechanism of registration and serious protection to provide for their needs immediately when they arrive is a very, very big challenge. Having said that, there's plenty of law on special protections across the EU. Under European law, the Human Rights Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, do provide for very specific obligations on states to protect minors and unaccompanied minors. In the US, we have both trafficking protections under our immigration law that apply to children, and also something called special immigrant juvenile status, which allows children to get immigration status once the fact that they don't have a parent taking care of them is documented and registered by the courts. So it's not a problem of lack of law, but again, it's not being carried out.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, next question.
If so many refugees...
Could you just give us your name, please?
Oh, my name is Mihiti. If so many refugees are fleeing their countries, what's happening to the country's economy? It seems that the countries are entering a poverty cycle in which poor economies cause people to seek refuge in other countries, which in turn makes the economy worse. What is the solution to this?
Thank you so much. Nice, simple question. Thank you. And we'll have one more question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Goda. May 2015 to September 2015, I must have kept every paper clipping from Financial Times that focused on the pictures of the refugee crisis, the migration crisis. 2015 September, I stopped because all I could do was cry over those paper clippings. Picking up from what respectable Susan just mentioned, within the confines of the bureaucracy of the laws and the rules that limit us from giving any humanitarian help, as a mother, as a woman, as a common man, what powers do I have to participate in this humanitarian crisis? How can it be more easier for me to help without bureaucracy?
Thank you so much for that really important question. So, first of all, the question about this, escalating cycle of poverty is the fact that refugees are leading to, population depletion and greater poverty and a vicious circle. Anybody want to address that and comment on that point? Yeah, Abdulkarim.
Actually, that's the root of the crisis in Syria. And as I mentioned, Syria now is losing their people. Like they are who's supposed to build the country again. And the problem, the links between these people when fleeing out of the country and Syria is really becoming less and less. And for the new generations, maybe they are not linked anymore with the country. In the neighboring countries, just in Turkey, they recorded approximately 200 or 300,000 new births for Syrians through the last 5 or 6 years who's never been in Syria, and maybe they are linked to Turkey more than Syria. So it is really a serious issue. So I think when studying the policies for maybe the UN agencies and for the international organizations when they are designing their intervention, I think we should make a link between the refugees, especially in the neighboring countries and anywhere in the world, and their home country. At least if there is any stability in the future, these people, they can come back to participate in raising the economic of their country again.
Yeah, as Noel said in the beginning, of course, most refugees, nearly all refugees want to go home, but where you have acute conflict, it's just impossible to even imagine that. And so this task of rebuilding then becomes really elusive. So I think it's a very important point. And anybody want to address this sort of point about the civil society and what individuals can do? Yeah.
I mean, I want to add to him as well, because I see it from Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon barely survived the civil war, and it's been a brain drain. A lot of people who could afford it left the country, and now you have 500,000 Palestinian refugees, about over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Syrian refugees. The garbage is not getting picked up. There's no electricity, no water. So the problem becomes worse. So I don't know how... it's bigger than Lebanon, so it's something where the international community needs to be involved. And I found, as of civil societies, there are a lot of local NGOs who do incredible work, and I give them so much credit than all the politicians, because they volunteer, people donate clothes, and they do makeshift schools for them. I think people in the US are nervous donating money to institutions in the Middle East, which is why I recommend looking up the Karam Foundation. The woman is from Aleppo. I don't know, do you know her? Lena.
I heard about her, yeah.
Yeah.
I know the woman very well.
Yeah, so they do a lot of work in Turkey, and then for me, when I was raising money, I wanted it to go to Lebanon. So they kind of were telling me where the money was going, and they found the local NGOs in Lebanon who helped the Karam Fund, who could work with them. So it's a very transparent way of donating money if you're in the US to look at them. I think they do fantastic work. So that's one recommendation I have. They probably have more.
Okay, we're nearly out of time. In fact, we are out of time. So I'll quickly take the last two questions and then wrap up. Yes, sir.
Do you mind if I just answer how you can help? Because I think that's really,
Absolutely.
really important one. We spent 2 years, my student teams and I, mapping what was happening in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt to all of the refugees, not just the Syrians, though we were focused on the Syrians. And we produced a very large report that actually lays out sort of a way forward, built on concrete state obligations, including here in the United States. And when we first started advocating around that report in Washington, we basically got the answer that nobody gives a blank about Syria. I think that's changed. And I think one of the most powerful delegations that is sympathetic to refugees is right here in Massachusetts. Our congressional representatives include people like Jim McGovern, who are absolutely phenomenal. He's worked on refugee issues way back from the Central American crises in the 80s onwards. And Capuano, Lizabeth Warren. These are people who, if you take an ask and join the refugee organizations around Boston who are asking not only for increased resettlement, but for temporary protection statuses, for new kinds of statuses similar to the ones that Canada has, private sponsorship. That would be absolutely incredible if we could get something like private sponsorship here and allow the Arab and Syrian communities to sponsor people from Syria, and the same for Somalis and others. It would be a small step, a huge step in the right direction, but a very small and modest thing to do. In addition, there are lots of organizations here in Boston working on the Syrian refugee crisis. There's an organization called New Day Syria, which is trying to help the refugees who are, once they're here, finding housing, plugging them into social services. We have an amazing network of refugee organizations right here in Boston. You can plug into any of them. And look at our report, please.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yes, okay, Finn.
Hi there, my name is Jeff Laurenti with the somewhat aging reunion class of 1971. I was struck by Rania's observation that there are often political agendas that work their way through the publicity given to one refugee crisis rather than another, and Noel's caution against having refugee situations in competition, perhaps in part driven by those political agendas. You mentioned Afghanistan, and I recall that 3 decades ago, people of our reunion class might remember, there was an enormous amount of press attention to Afghan refugees when it was against the Soviet intervention. And for the past 18 years, 17 years, since the American intervention, no press stories at all about the Afghan refugees in Pakistan. A lot of press attention to Syrian refugees by people who feel revulsion against the brutality of the Assad government, maybe seeking or hoping for more robust Western intervention. But on Congo, on South Sudan, on all these refugee situations in Africa, none. When these refugees make their way across the Mediterranean from Libya into Italy, there's a blurring, an elision, whether they are migrants or refugees, and whether they could all have the door closed to them. So since your summit dealt with refugees and migrants, to what extent are we seeing an elision of the two in the international debate? To what extent do we need international law to maintain very clear distinctions? How do we then hope to have those distinctions actually implemented?
Thank you very much. Yes, and the last question.
Yeah. I don't have a question, but I would like to add something, please. One of the biggest countries that help Syrian refugees is Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has welcomed Saudi refugees and has hosted million Syrian refugees. And Saudi Arabia and Saudi government gave them visa to stay inside Saudi Arabia and gave them opportunities to treatment in Saudi hospitals and study in schools and universities. And give them work. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. The question about this blending, this is the final question about, should we be keeping refugee and migration regimes separate, or are they being fused together illicitly?
I would say, first of all, we have to start from the premise that whether you're a refugee or a migrant, you're a human being and you enjoy human rights, regardless of where you are. So there are legal distinctions between refugees and migrants, and in the summit, those legal distinctions are maintained because there is a difference between the situation of refugees is different in that if they're returned to their homes, they will face persecution or a danger that will affect their life or health. And that is different from the situation of a migrant who may go home to a difficult situation, but perhaps not one that would cause him to suffer persecution or put his life or health at risk. So within the legal regime, the distinctions are being made, but there is more attention to the issue of migrants who do not qualify as refugees, but who do need human rights protections and may need special assistance because of the horrible dangers that they face, either as victims of trafficking. They may need protection as unaccompanied children. They may need special support because of the dangers that they've faced. For example, in those horrible boats where people's lives are being put at risk. So while the legal distinctions are maintained, it is important to extend the protections that are necessary to each. But I wanted to say one more thing about how we can get involved, because I think we've touched on civil society involvement and financial support, and we've talked about the political side. Another part of it, and this comes really from the consultations that we did with refugees before the summit, the one thing that refugees have said, the question was, what do you want world leaders to know about refugees that they just critically misunderstand? And we asked that question in a lot of different groups of refugees, and the answer was almost always the same, is that we have a lot to offer. We are good at what we do. We're professionals. So one more thing that you can do is you can hire a refugee. And because, look, refugees are really, they can be fantastic employees. We have lots of data to show that. And they're not a burden on society. Refugees don't like to be considered a burden. That term burden sharing in the 1951 convention is annoying to most. Well, we've tried to change it to responsibility. That's a whole long debate. Member states don't agree with that. The word in the convention is burden, but refugees don't like it, and I understand that. So hire a refugee, and I don't think you'll regret it.
Thank you so much.
Well, let me just say, this has been a fabulous, if sobering, symposium, and I want to thank you all very much for being here, and I want to ask the audience to join me in thanking you with applause.